Hi everyone, and welcome to the latest Bristol University Press webinar on power, policing and public order. I'm Rebecca Tomlinson, I'm commissioning editor for our criminology books, and I'm delighted to introduce our speakers, Mike Hough, author of Good Policing, Alan Greene, author of Emergency Powers in a Time of Pandemic, and John Kendall, author of Regulating Police Detention. I had the pleasure of working with both Mike and John on their books, and they've both been such important additions to the criminology list. Alan's book, published late last year on the law list, and was one of the first to look at issue of emergency powers in the pandemic. So I'll just go over a bit of housekeeping. Mike, Alan and John will talk for about 5 minutes each, and then the panel will discuss their contributions with each other. After that, I'll be putting your questions to the panel, so please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Please be clear about who your question is for, or whether it's for the panel more generally. And if you have any technical issues, please use the chat function as well. And then details of how to order their books at 50% discount will be available there too. So great, thank you. And I'm now going to hand over to Mike.
Good afternoon, everybody. As Becca says, I'm going to talk about my book, Good Policing, subtitled Trust, Legitimacy and Authority. And given how prominent policing of cops is, I'll end up with a few policing and I'll try and summarize the key themes in my book, 5 minutes, 6 minutes. And what I was trying to do was to examine an old idea, policing by consent, through the lens of procedural justice theory. I and colleagues have done quite a lot of work on this over the last 10 years, much of it drawing on international surveys like the European Social Survey. We've been trying to explain why people obey the law, not why they break the law. We've inverted the usual big criminology question and are interested in explanations of compliance. And as I said, I think the book has some relevance now because the policing of the COVID regulations is getting really challenging, and issues of trust and legitimacy cannot be avoided. So that's what I will end on. The core ideas. We take it as read that a measure of a good society is that citizens consent to the rule of law. I want to live in a country where consent to the rule of law is properly embedded. And by that I mean citizens feel a normative obligation to obey the law and the police rather than make instrumental calculations about the costs and benefits of law breaking. The central concept to my book is legitimacy, an old Weberian concept. When people confer legitimacy on cops or any other authority for that matter, they have a sense of a duty to obey, and that duty to obey flows from a sense of moral alignment with that authority, a sense in policing that the cops are on our side. Legitimacy generates compliance with the law and cooperation with the police and the courts. And it is the gold dust of the criminal justice system. You shouldn't try and force people to comply. You should want to make them want to comply. We've spent a lot of time in our research trying to identify the building blocks of legitimacy. Legitimacy flows from trust, and institutionally there are different sorts of trust, at least especially for the police. Trust in procedural fairness, trust in distributive fairness, trust in fair outcomes, and trust in competence or effectiveness. Police and politicians tend to think that the key building blocks are trust in fair outcomes and trust in effectiveness. So they want to promise a really effective police force in getting to grips with crime. Actually, procedural justice theory indicates, I think overwhelmingly, that procedural fairness is the strongest predictor of legitimacy, more than fair outcomes, more than trust in competence. And procedural fairness means treating people with dignity, treating them with respect, listening to them, explaining decisions, and playing by the rules. in a few words, policing style is as important or possibly more important than the content of what the police actually do. That should give you a flavour of the themes of the book. I hope you want to go on and read it. Let me end with a few thoughts on procedural justice and policing the pandemic. In general, I think it's useful to think of two options for policing, and specifically about the pandemic, two options for policing the regulations. Option A is to mount a firm, credible deterrent threat of hard policing, promise deterrence and deliver on deterrence. And the second option is to persuade people that the rules are legitimate and deserve to be obeyed. Continental police, I think, although I haven't done any research on this, have tended to go for the first option, firm, credible deterrent threats. My brother in France has to fill out a form when he goes to the baker's in advance of going out, and is fined if he doesn't. The UK cops in March started off with a few flurries of hard policing, but mainly went for the legitimacy route, trying to persuade people, explaining to people why there were the rules, persuading them that it's the right thing to do, and as a final resort, fining people. The exceptions, Derbyshire seems to have a fairly erratic history with policing by drone, if you remember, and more recently the policing of those two women who went for a walk after a 5-mile drive. Devon and Cornwall had roadblocks in March. These things damaged trust and legitimacy, I think it's fairly clear to say. But the College of Policing have persuaded most forces to have a progressive, procedurally fair approach to policing. What's really made the whole thing unravel, of course, is the harm caused by government. Flouting of the rules by Cummings, by Neil Ferguson, by the Scottish Chief Medical Officer, endless U-turns, endless fuzzy communication with Boris telling us to rely on British common sense at one point, which effectively transformed legal requirements into mere advice. I hope that my second option, persuading people of the legitimacy of the regulations, is the right route. But for that to work, it has to be underpinned by political legitimacy. And it looks like the UK is a case study in how not to do it. The second spike, this failure of political handling has really undermined the regulations' legitimacy, not amongst old, frightened myself, but by young, healthy people who feel immortal. It's been made worse by the fact that government advice doesn't align precisely with the regulations in law that the cops have to enforce, but goes broader, which has created great difficulties for the police. We're now in a situation where the regulations are widely ignored by large proportions of the population. And I suspect, we'll find out soon, but I suspect that the police are going to have to shift from my preferred option B, policing by persuasion and consent, to a hard deterrent approach. But we'll see. I don't think there's enough time to rebuild legitimacy in the regulations before the police have to do something, but I hope I'm wrong. That's all I've got to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike. Alan, if you want to go next, please. Thanks.
Thanks, Rebecca. Okay, so my book is called Emergency Powers in a Time of Pandemic. And what I look at is, I suppose, the concept of what a state of emergency is and whether it can and should be applied to this pandemic. So most of the literature and most of my past research has been to do with national security crisis and counterterrorism. So my book is basically an exploration of mapping emergency powers onto this pandemic. And there are absolutely certain similarities, but there are also some differences that we are seeing. And some of my points that I'm going to make now are going to pick up on the themes mentioned by Mike. So the first thing, and maybe the focus of my talk, is really to look at the impact of these powers, of emergency powers, on the rule of law. So emergencies, by definition, are these sudden, unforeseen crises that the existing ordinary law or governance cannot deal with. And so we need to take an exceptional response to this exceptional situation. And the entire justification of this exceptional response is to defeat the crisis and restore normalcy. In the context of the rule of law, because the crisis is sudden and unforeseen, and it's generally the argument made that decisions need to be taken swiftly and decisively, we invariably end up with broad conferral of discretionary power onto the executive, because it's the body that's most equipped to make decisions quickly. And in the context then of this pandemic, we're seeing that broad conferral of discretionary power by the executive being fed down the system onto decision makers on the ground, i.e. onto the police. And the results of this, therefore, are quite broad and vague regulations and laws being applied onto the police, and the police are then being put in a position whereby they have to enforce this. So this has negative consequences for the rule of law. Even if we take the thinnest definition of the rule of law as being law that is clear and certain in its prescription. So basically we outline the rules, and we outline the rules in advance, and that's probably the narrowest definition of the rule of law that we have. But it's important to remember as well that this, because of the nature of emergencies, this broad conferral of power and drafting of the law is arguably a feature rather than a glitch of emergency powers, and it's a feature rather than a glitch of the regulations that have been enacted. And as Mike mentioned, the examples of the two women in Derbyshire, or even Boris Johnson being accused of breaking the rules by going out on his bike and cycling, I think it was 7 miles from 10 Downing Street. The argument is whether that constituted a breach of the rules. And actually, if you do dig into the guidelines and into the rules, this is where we're having a problem with what the law actually says and how the government has interpreted that law, or provided guidelines onto how that law ought to be interpreted and ought to be applied. And if you actually look at the regulations as to what they say, it states that you cannot, if we're talking about exercise, okay, the requirements are that you cannot leave your house without a reasonable excuse. And a reasonable excuse is defined in section 6, subsection 1, where we talk about an exercise. And it basically says that you can't leave without taking exercise alone. You can only exercise either alone or with other members of your household. There's nothing in the law itself actually that states you must stay local. That comes in the guidelines. And in the guidelines there, on that statement as to what constitutes local, that's not defined. So ultimately, you actually have the police not actually enforcing the regulations. You have the police enforcing the guidelines, which arguably are not law. And the guidelines really are only the government's interpretation of the rules. Ultimately, we can't get the authoritative interpretation of these rules until we come to the judiciary. It could be up to the judiciary to decide. So really what we're seeing at the minute is quite broad conferral of power on the police, and then this discrepancy between the government and the actual law as to what it says. And that doesn't just affect this idea of whether exercise has to be local or not. It also affects things like what constitutes exercise. Okay, so there was confusing, I suppose, guidance issued as to whether angling fell under exercise or not, with the Angling Trust putting out two different different statements in a 24-hour period as to whether angling constituted exercise. The question to ask, I think, is whether this could simply be drafted away. And absolutely, a lot of the confusion we are seeing around these COVID regulations, particularly pertaining to exercise, could be solved by some degree of more accurate drafting. For example, a geographical restriction, express geographical restriction to where and how far you can exercise from your house. So Scotland, for example, has done that. It has a 5-mile restriction. And in Ireland as well, where I'm originally from, Ireland has a 5-kilometer restriction as to how far you can exercise from your house. So these difficulties could be alleviated to an extent by more accurate drafting. Certainly the more higher profile cases could be fixed in that way. But the government has issued a statement today saying that they intentionally and deliberately did not put in a distance restriction in place. It'd be interesting to discuss as to whether they should have. But again, this comes. I'm going to just finish up a bit on talking about some of the differences between these emergency powers in response to COVID and maybe what we're seeing in the context of counterterrorism generally. So as I've said before, this broad conferral of discretionary power is a feature of emergency powers, but often these powers, because they're not seen to affect everybody generally, that they tend to go unnoticed, or they tend to actually be democratically popular. So this is why counterterrorism powers are seen as democratic popular, because they're seen to apply only to what's known as a suspect community, only to that population whose loyalty to the state is questionable and from which the terrorist threat emanates from. And so because these powers look like they only apply to these individuals, then they become democratically popular, and therefore they have this propensity to be entrenched. In contrast, the pandemic powers are seen as being applicable to us all and are seen to affect us all. And it is potentially the case that the democratic forces in place will actually do their job in ensuring that these powers are temporary. However, this idea of a suspect community, I think, that explains to an extent the distinction between the pandemic emergency powers and counterterrorism emergency powers, but I don't think it justifies them. It certainly doesn't justify the permanence of these counterterrorism powers. And I think, when we look at a lot of what are known as lockdown skeptics and those who are critical of emergency powers because of their impact on human rights, I think it's particularly noticeable that their silence with regards to counterterrorism powers is quite notable. So, for example, if you look at Schedule 7 of the Terrorism Act, so this is the power that police have to examine and detain anybody at an airport without reasonable excuse for the purposes of assessing whether they're basically an individual involved in terrorism. In principle, all of us could be subject to that power when we walk into an airport. And you could only imagine the uproar if all of us were subject to this. But we see from the statistics that, that it really is only being subject to the suspect community. It's being used disproportionately against Asian and British Asian males in particular. That stated, I would caution against saying that we mightn't have a suspect community or the discriminatory application of these police powers in the context of the pandemic, because there have been statistics shown, particularly released in June and July, that showed that more BAME individuals were fined than the white population under existing coronavirus laws. So it is that nevertheless are seeing this disproportionate application of these police powers, and that potentially feeds into Mike's earlier question issue with regards to the legitimacy and the perceived legitimacy of these powers and whether that potentially undermines them. So I will leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Alan. And now we're going to go to John.
Thanks very much, Rebecca. Yeah, I'm going to talk about this picture that you now see all over your screen in explaining my research into one particular aspect of police custody. And the concept of trust has been brought up to me. You'll see how relevant it is to this. This photograph is of a typical detention cell in a police station. I visited quite a few of these places during my research, and they all look like this, except that this one's very, very tidy and clean. You can see that the detainee is sitting on the bench, and you've got the blue plastic covered mattress and pillow, which is always issued. On his right, behind the screen there is his own toilet. It's very busy, this cell. I'll explain what all the people are doing in a moment. But this is the sort of cell, if you were arrested by the police, you'd be taken to a station and you'd be kept in one of these cells while they decided what to do with you, which might be to charge you with an offence, or to release you pending further investigation, or to give you a caution, or, as happens in quite a lot of cases, to release you without any action. Now, where my research came in was a little-known statutory scheme called the Independent Custody Visitors Scheme. And the Independent Custody Visitors Scheme enables, quotes, ordinary members of the public to drop in unannounced at police stations and check and report on the welfare of the detainees in the station. So in this picture here, we have a detainee and we have two custody visitors who quite unusually are both BAME people. And you can see they're asking questions of the detainee, and they're also, one of them is making some notes on a clipboard as to what the answers are. Very key in this picture is the presence of the custody staff member standing at the doorway, and I'll come back to explain to you why that's so significant in a moment or two. Now, this is the central activity of the Independent Custody Visiting Scheme. When the visitors turn up at the police station, the main thing they do is to go and see each detainee who the police allow them to see, because some of them they think are too dangerous to be interviewed this way. Each detainee gets about 3 minutes only with visitors, which is a very, very short period of time for someone who turns up. They don't know who they are and what they're there for. And one of the custody staff members told me that she thought that most of the detainees had no idea what the visitors are visiting them for. It's a pretty cramped space to have people in your cell like that. And one of the detainees told me I was able to interview these detainees in much less cramped space and to have a good deal longer than 3 minutes to talk to them. And one of them said to me that it was a bit awkward having two people turn up in his cell like that, because he hadn't had a shower for 2 days. And it turned out that the police had not actually told him that he could have a shower, and naturally felt a bit awkward worrying about his own personal hygiene when there were people asking what seemed to be quite important questions. The absence of trust is particularly noticeable in these encounters because the detainees don't know what they're there for. They're very naturally suspicious of absolutely everything that happens in a police station, where they seem to have no cards to play at all. And visitors don't really come over to them as people whom they should trust. It's not surprising that that's the case, because if you meet someone you've never met before and they start asking you all sorts of questions, you might feel a certain reluctance to tell them what the answers were. And one of the detainees said quite simply to me that I don't trust the visitors because I've only just met them. And detainees generally found the encounters fairly useless. One said, pointless, they can't do nothing, they can't change nothing, they're wasting my time. The most critical feature of this is the lack of confidentiality in this encounter, because there is the custody staff member standing in the doorway, able to listen and observe everything that's going on. And to quote another of my detainee interviewees, he said to me, I wanted to tell the visitors I was annoyed because I had asked the guards questions 2 hours ago and I'd got no answers, but I couldn't tell the visitors because the guards were standing there. So with the guards, the custody staff members standing there, listening in, the detail would fear reprisals after the visitors had left. Now, several of the detainees I interviewed made this point, but only one of the visitors did. The visitors didn't seem to be aware that this was a problem. And this sole interviewee said that the proximity of the staff member destroyed the confidentiality of the visitor's relationship with the detainees, and with it, as she put it, the whole purpose of custody visiting. If these visitors are there to look after the detainees, their welfare, they've got to be able to talk to them candidly about what's going on. And this arrangement, which is it isn't usually quite as obvious as this, but the staff member is usually pretty close by. This arrangement makes it very difficult, impossible really, for the basic function of custody visiting to be effective. It's naturally justified on the basis of safety for the visitors, but all the detainees are risk assessed anyway. Now, with the pandemic coronavirus, things have got sort of slightly worse because visitors now are unwilling to actually visit the police stations. So what they're doing is they're hooking up with Zoom and telephone conferences, and they ask the detainees how things are. And of course, the police are there listening into all this, and so nothing of any significance passes. I mean, I should make the point that abuse of detainees does take place in police stations. And if some serious abuse had taken place, or if the detainee had simply asked a question and not got any answer, he would want to tell the visitors about this complaint. And this lack of confidentiality makes that impossible. The visitors are there, in my view, to provide some kind of regulatory function of the police, but the scheme simply doesn't work for this and several other reasons it doesn't work. One of them is that the visitors are basically trained not to actually challenge the police. And one thing a regulator has to do is challenge the institution it's regulating. Visitors have got a big problem there because the police are an immensely powerful institution, and they've got things sorted out with this so it doesn't cause them any real trouble. Now, all this is described in my book, Regulating Police Detention, which is subtitled Voices from Behind Closed Doors. And this is the first time that the voices of detainees in police custody have been heard talking about this custody visiting business. And since it's supposed to be for their benefit, it's interesting that they think it's pretty well useless. And I try to spend my time campaigning about this. I'm glad you were able to attend the webinar today and hear about it. I'm hoping that there'll be more publicity about it shortly because the Home Affairs Committee of the House of Commons is looking into this and will shortly be investigating it further. Thanks very much. That's my bit.
Thanks so much, everyone. John, if you could just stop sharing, thank you. So some incredibly interesting points made there. Before we go to the Q&A, the panel are going to have a chance to discuss each other's contributions. So if someone would like to kick us off, I don't know if any of you have questions for each other.
Can I ask Alan something? Which is, Alan, do you think it's inevitable in an emergency that there should be a mismatch between government advice and the detail of the regulations? Or do you think that they could have simply either framed the advice to be more consistent with the regulations or vice versa? And I would have gone for more care in framing the advice. For example, in the initial lockdown, that an hour was all that you were allowed for exercise, which wasn't in the regulations.
Yes, I do think, however, that there is an issue with the police essentially enforcing something that isn't law. And for that reason, I do think it's important that if there is to be concrete advice or concrete guidelines like that, that they are expressly put in the legislation. So if it was, for example, like you said, an hour restriction, or the geographical restriction is the one that I mentioned, that yes, I think that should be expressly put in the regulations. As to why that wasn't, I'm not 100% sure. You know, the guidelines should rather clarify. They should clarify what the laws are rather than expand on what the laws are. And I think that the current regulations, they're expanding rather than clarifying. I think other states have certainly done, and even within the UK have done a better job than that. I think Scottish drafting of the regulations has been much better than England. And I was talking to maybe some, it's not in the book, but just casual friends who work in the drafting department. A lot of them suggest that it might be because of we have, you know, some confusion and constant changing of government policy, with the regulations then constantly catching up. If you follow Adam Wagner on Twitter, who has done an excellent thread on keeping the regulations up to date, I think he posted today that they've been updated on average once every 4 days. That's how frequently they're changing them, and very often you'll hear the government announcement before the regulations are actually updated themselves. So everyone is constantly trying to keep up and trying to understand what is actually going on. And I don't think that is inevitable. I think you can have some flexibility, but I think at the minute we have a bit of a problem. Hope that answers the question.
Yes, I agree. Right answer.
Good. Could I ask John a question about whether, so that picture, as you suggested, everything seems quite tight and intimate, and whether those visits, etc., have been affected by COVID, and whether there have been any restrictions and constraints on the visiting program as a result of the pandemic.
Well, there should have been proper arrangements made for social distancing and masks and all that sort of thing, and the meeting should have taken place in a bigger space. So what's happened in some places, I don't know the whole story, is that the visits don't take place at all, and they're done virtually by telephone conferencing and Zoom meetings, which means that the police know everything that's passing anyway. So it just makes it more absurd, really, more useless. That's what's happened during coronavirus, and I can understand why that's happened, but I think they should have taken a much stronger line about it, and followed the basic rule that these people need to actually be there to see what's happening. They can't do it by remote. Can I ask both of you whether you think that the trust that's important in public life has, by the pandemic, been lost by politicians rather than the police?
I'm very much in that camp myself. I think the police have done, overall, with exceptions, quite a good job. And I think the guidance on enforcement that comes from the College of Policing makes really good sense.
Yeah, and certainly I think, if we look at where the issues are, the issues certainly lie at the top rather than at the bottom. So yeah, I would agree.
Great, well, thanks everyone. There are quite a few questions, so I'll just jump straight into those if that's okay. So this one here is from Mike Hope. Why does the panel think the government is so reluctant to provide clear, unambiguous legislation around COVID issues such as exercise distances, when it would be a significant help to both public understanding and police ability to effectively enforce where appropriate?
Would you mind if I answer first? I think if I were to speculate, it's down to just political philosophy. It's down, we have seen a genuine reluctance from this government relative to other governments to actually implement policies in the first place. We see constant language as well surrounding personal and individual responsibility. So I think it's potentially that political philosophy coming out and manifesting itself, that this is individual responsibility, potentially a reluctance to use state power, which, you know, does correlate to an extent, I suppose, with conservative political philosophy. So that would be my speculation as to why, but obviously I've got no concrete basis to back that up. I'd be interested to know what the other panelists think.
I think they might get themselves into quite deep water if they said you must exercise only for an hour, you must drive for exercise only 3 miles, when context is so critically important. I think you might have to have legislation that stresses reasonableness. I mean, a personal example, I live in the middle of the country, not many people here at all, and I have a large puppy that demands a walk 3 times a day. If I was told it must be an hour and it must be once, I wouldn't think that was reasonable. Nor would the dog.
Great, thanks both. So I've got another question here that looks like it's for John. So have you considered what the alternative is in regards to police visiting detainees in custody? Having worked as a police officer previously, the reason that a custody detention officer is present is purely for the safety of those visiting individuals, as opposed to the intent to breach confidentiality. Logistically, I wonder how both safety and confidentiality could not be compromised.
Yeah, sure. I'd like to answer that, because I should explain that when I was doing this research, I should have said more about this. I was able to interview detainees in a much better environment than the cell, and arrangements were made for me to interview detainees in a room that had a table and chairs, where we could have much more time. I had up about 15 or 20 minutes with each of them. The room was quite near the custody sergeant's desk, so they could keep an eye on what was happening there. I think there was a panic button there as well. But it was very different from having someone listening in the doorway. And if you think that the issue of confidentiality is important, as I do, then in that situation, arrangements were made which enabled me to have what seemed to be, as much as possible in a police station, a confidential chat with those detainees, which is simply impossible in the arrangements which are commonly used and are sanctified by the code of practice, which says that that's how they're supposed to be done. So it depends which you think is more important in life. As I said, I thought that the detainees were all risk assessed, so the risk was presumably pretty low that anything might happen. And getting enabling the detainees to pass confidences was just completely impossible.
John, could I ask, is that form of supervision by officers universal, or did it reflect where your research was set?
Well, that particular picture is a real life picture, according to Getty Images, and it was quite common for them to be close by. What the rules say about this, rather confusingly, is that the interview has to take place within the site, but outside of the hearing of the detention officer. Well, you know, it's almost impossible to know how that could be conducted within that extraordinary wording. And inevitably, it's usually that they can both see and hear what's going on. And if you can see what's going on, you can usually hear it as well. So it's complete nonsense, I think. When I was a visitor myself some years before I did this research, was I decided that visiting needed study rather than me going on doing it. And sometimes the custody sergeant would allow us to, because they knew who we were pretty well by that stage, to talk to the detainees without being supervised. I think that's probably quite unusual.
Okay, thanks, John. So this is a question for Mike here, and it says, I wondered if you had any thoughts about enforcement and whether we have enough officers to move towards the hard deterrent approach you suggest maybe next. I also hope this is not the case, given what I think is a disproportionality of current emergency regulations.
I can't really say, I can't answer the question about resources, but it just strikes me that non-compliance with the regulations.
Okay, I've lost Mike. So I'll just maybe move on to the next question and hopefully he could rejoin us. So this question from Liz Turner, Chair of the MPCC said earlier this week that this is a public health emergency, not a policing emergency. Is he right to imply that we should not expect the police to take on a larger role in encouraging compliance? Don't know if either of the panel could answer that one.
It's a tough one. I think, and it's kind of what my book discusses, is that it's impossible to almost identify an area that hasn't been affected by COVID. So like in Ireland, for example, and we had the issue in the UK too with regards to its effect on the education system, its effect on sport, its effect on health, and as you said, the effect on police. So because of its impact, I don't think we can just solely focus on the police and expect them to do it all themselves. But at the same time, that doesn't necessarily mitigate from the necessity of these regulations and on these restrictions to enforce a lockdown. So I'm not sure whether I've answered that question or not, but I think yes, it's bigger than the police, but I think it still is required, I would say. Yeah.
So there's just one more question, I think, here for John. It says, could you share further about your research into the treatment of detainees and what was the most surprising thing that you learned?
I don't know, really. It's quite an eye-opener it was a really important part of my research to be able to talk to these detainees, because it happened very late in the research and I made a lot of efforts to try and talk to them. And eventually a crack opened in the door and allowed me to do so. I think the thing that I take from this is not any individual incident with detainees, but just the whole experience of being able to talk to them, which was immensely important. And it put me in mind of things that I wouldn't otherwise have thought of. If I can just turn the question around a bit to mention what mattered there, was that I hadn't really appreciated this, but detainees' requests are sometimes taken to the custody sergeant during visits. There may be requests for information, for instance, and what the visitors don't do is they don't go back to the detainees and tell them what the answer is or what the result is of their inquiry. And so the detainees get the impression that visitors really aren't interested in helping them. They're just there to ask questions and fill in a form, which they then send off to the Police and Crime Commissioner. And that was something I wouldn't have learnt had I not spoken to the detainees. And so I'd rather answer the question that way, that the value of all this was to understand the thing much better rather than find out particularly remarkable individual incidents, which didn't really happen in that way. Thank you.
Well, I think that's all the questions done now. There were a couple more that were specifically for Mike that obviously he can't answer, but I'll try and pass those on and maybe we could put them out on social media or in a follow-up email. So thank you all so much for attending, and thanks to our speakers, Mike Hough, Alan Greene and John Kendall. Details of how to order their books at 50% discount are available in the chat, and we've got another webinar coming up in February, so you can see our social media or our website for more details about that. So great, so thank you very much both.
Thank you.
Bye.
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 Bye-bye.